Welcome back, horror fans, cinephiles, and giallo enthusiasts. This is Tanner Leeser, your host for all things giallo here on The King in Giallo. Our next stop on our journey through giallo cinema is the second giallo film from Lucio Fulci, A Lizard in a Woman's Skin, released in 1971. This video is an edited down version. Herein, you will find the overview portion of the full-length video. Coming next week will be the complete deep dive with the review and GialliTally. This video may be watched without any spoilers. Here is A Lizard in a Woman's Skin overview. A Lizard in a Woman's Skin is an Italian, Spanish, and French co-production. The film is directed by Lucio Fulci, who also co-wrote the film's script along with Robert Gianvitti, Jose Luis Martinez Mola, and Andre Tranche. The music is composed by Ennio Morricone, with orchestral direction by Bruno Nicolai. The cast is comprised of Florinda Bolkan as Carol Hammond, Stanley Baker as Inspector Corfin, John Sorrell as Frank Hammond, Leo Genn as Edmund Brighton, Alberto de Mendoza as Sergeant Brandon, Eddie Galliani, aka Ellie Galliani, or Justine Gall, billed as Eddie Gall, as Joan Hammond. Pick a name, girl. Sylvia Monti as Deborah, Anita Strindberg as Julia Durer, and Jorge Rigaud as Dr. Kerr. The plot follows Carol Hammond, the troubled daughter of a wealthy lawyer and aspiring politician, Edmund Brighton, whose husband works for her father's law practice. Carol has been plagued by terrifying psychedelic dreams and has sought help from a psychoanalyst, Dr. Kerr. Numerous of her dreams center around her neighbor, Julia Durer, a provocative hedonist who throws drug-fueled parties, whom Dr. Kerr believes must represent something of duplicitous nature within Carol. The strange dreams become reality after Carol envisions herself murdering Julia whilst being watched by two others, only for Julia to actually have been murdered. Scotland Yard gets involved to solve the crime, and Carol becomes the prime suspect, but her father is determined to prove her innocence. The plot thickens as adultery, blackmail, and murder arise. It might not come as a shock to fans and critics to learn that, according to people who knew Lucio Fulci, he harbored a distrust towards psychoanalysis, which is aided by the fact that he oftentimes, through his filmography, would bash the practice. This particular film happens to find the master at the zenith of his pull as a director, working with a larger budget than in subsequent films, and surrounded by a cadre of competent collaborators. Troy Howarth questions if Fulci could have continued to work at this scale through his career if he would have been able to garner more respect from the film snobs and the cineastes versus the bloodthirsty gorehounds. I think Fulci's early work does prove that he was something of a genius, and despite also loving his later films, the gory ones mentioned, that he unfortunately does become relegated to just an exploitation director who likes sex and violence. What I find humorous about this film is how much it behaves like an Agatha Christie plot with Fulci directing. The investigation is very tedious and thorough, and if you are not paying close attention, you might get lost along the way. Similar to Perversion Story, Fulci clearly cares a lot about the structure of the mystery and the motivations driving all the parties involved in the tale. As he would go on to say, Fulci hated Dario Argento's thrillers for being sloppy in their construction, yet brilliant in their execution. Despite all his work, Fulci would reflect on his own thrillers as being too mechanical in their structure. Honestly, my opinion of this is yes and yes. I love Argento, but I feel he's entirely a visual artist and works best when he has someone else writing the scripts. Fulci does have brilliantly crafted narratives, but they sometimes can feel a bit much. If you believe a mystery should not be beholden to the trappings of logic, then you might find Fulci a bit boring. However, Fulci allows himself to go to amazing places within his thrillers, this one in particular, as he uses the hallucinogenic dreams as his excuse to indulge in some truly awe-inspiring dream sequences with fantastical elements. Fulci demonstrates a masterful comprehension and understanding of the material with his usage of camera technique and frame composition coupled with evocative editing. The result is one of Fulci's best directed films, one of the more stylish giallo films of this golden age era, and one of the most imaginative LSD fever dreams in cinema. The film deals with plenty of warring elements. The real versus the imagined as seen in the dreams, the ensuing murder and the psychoanalysis evaluations, the repressed versus the uninhibited, which drives the conflict in the beginning as through Carol's sessions with Dr. Care, we are able to discern that she might be at odds with herself. Is Carol truly disgusted and mortified by her neighbor's lifestyle? Or is she disturbed because of her own desires to indulge in such activities, and the shame of this reality causes her to seek professional help because of her position in high society? In the dreams with Julia, there are strong lesbian implications, suggesting by her doctor that Carol might be repressing a side of herself, and the violence in her one dream is a metaphor for her trying to kill that side of herself. As the plot unfolds, however, we the viewers start to question whether the obvious reveal of Carol being the killer might not actually be the convenient frame job from a blackmailer who has been hovering outside the action. Fulci walks a tightrope in this film of remaining coherent and logical while always keeping his eye on the natural conclusion of the story, but also allowing himself through the narrative to indulge in imaginative and experimental sequences, thanks to the employment of dreams and hallucinations. Playing within this caveat he has created for himself, Fulci is able to play Argento's game without sacrificing the integrity of the plot, and the final product brings us some of the most brutally graphic and imagined instances seen in Italian horror of this time, paired with some very realistic and relatable fears and pains which elicit a visceral reaction from all. Everything foreshadows the career Fulci would go on to weave, and the legacy he would leave on Italian horror and horror in general, but here, the madness is more reined in and focused. Fulci detractors might say his later films make no sense, but this criticism cannot be made here. The movie does everything in its power to weave in surreal elements while still finding its way to a realistic and logical conclusion, even if that means the ending is not as action-packed or spectacle-driven as some of his competitors within the genre. Fulci proves that he was beholden to the types of detective stories that inspired him, and the mystery and its conclusion are more important to him than a throwaway moment of pulling the rug out from under the audience. Fulci's collaborators on this film are all putting their best foot forward. The sets and art direction on display reflect the extravagant production value. The lighting intensifies the dreamlike atmosphere. The camera work from Mario Bava's longtime camera operator, Ubaldo Terzano, oscillates between balanced and well-composed, and unsettling and jarring when it is necessary to the telling. The special effects by Carlo Rambaldi were in fact so convincing that a particular scene involving eviscerated dogs was believed to be real, and Lucio Fulci was brought up on animal cruelty charges and jailed, and thus was only released when Rambaldi was able to produce the prop dogs he had used. Ennio Morricone's score is another one-of-a-kind soundtrack and adds to the off-putting state of mind of the character, and despite myself personally not loving the soundtrack through and through, I recognize the determination and creativity which spawned it. Florinda Balkan wonderfully embodies the unhinged Carol and does what she can to not let the performance slink into the dreaded one-dimensional territory. She would end up working with Fulci yet again in his third and next giallo film, Don't Torture a Duckling, 1972. Stanley Baker has the proud distinction of making an inspector in a giallo film both competent and likable through the usage of cynicism which never tips him over the edge into being unsympathetic. The Welsh actor was born in 1928 and entered films in the 1940s, where he quickly became associated as a sort of tough, rough-and-tumble type with roles in The Cruel Sea, 1953, Hell Drivers, 1957, and Violent Playground, 1958. Baker would do a series of films with director Joseph Losey, including The Criminal, 1960, Ava, 1962, and Accident, 1967. One of his biggest roles would be the 1964 epic Zulu. The fact that Baker would take on this Italian film role is a rather rare outing for him. Baker would go on to be knighted in 1976, months before he would succumb to lung cancer at the age of 48. Leo Genn plays Carol's successful father with a lot at stake. Genn was born in 1905 and would become a true veteran of British cinema in the 20th century. Some of his roles include Henry V, 1944 by Laurence Olivier, Green for Danger, 1946 by Sidney Gilliatt, and The Snake Pit, 1948 by Anatole Litvak. Genn was nominated for an Oscar for his performance in Quo Vadis, 1951, and by the 1960s, he would start to transition into genre films such as 10 Little Indians, 1965, and Circus of Fear, 1966, both by Harry Alan Towers, and The Bloody Judge, 1969, by Jess Franco. Giallo veterans in the flick include John Sorrell, famously in The Sweet Body of Deborah, 1968. Sylvia Monti would go on to be in The Fifth Chord later this year in 1971. Alberto de Mendoza, who was in Fulci's first giallo, Perversion Story, 1969, as well as the giallo which came out weeks prior to Lizard, The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward, 1971. Jorge Rigaud, The Case of the Bloody Iris, 1972, and Eli Gialliani, seen in $5 for an August Moon, 1970. Thank you for watching this overview-only video. Don't miss the full overview, review, and GialliTally for A Lizard in a Woman's Skin next week. As of right now, the movie is very difficult to find streaming in the US as it is unavailable mostly. Don't forget to like this video and join me next week to see the rest of this review. Comment your predictions for the AZ score for the movie and the final GialliTally score. Give The King in Giallo a follow on Instagram and a like on Facebook. Subscribe to The King in Giallo Patreon to see early access to my videos, with some videos able to be seen up to 3 weeks in advance before they go on YouTube. Plus, exclusive content found only there, such as the viewings, and very soon there will be podcasts, Let's Plays for Giallo-inspired games, and book reviews for Giallo-inspired books. This year there will be a whole lot of new content. If you subscribe to me there on Patreon, I will have direct conversations with you, and I appreciate your feedback and want to know what types of content you would like for me to produce. Thank you very much for your continued support. This is Tanner Leeser for The King in Giallo, and if nothing else, I'll see you next time.